Next up is Juliana Holterhaus. She's got a background in decision sciences and psychological research and is the general manager for market research for Lumi, who are our silver sponsors. Thank you very much for that. She's just completed her PhD in motivational science, the motivational science of mobile technology use. Absolutely spot on. And having not so long ago done my own PhD, I know the pain. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Juliana. Thank you.
All right, better, everybody? All right, so today I'm going to be talking to you about the psychology of smartphone engagement, and hopefully, thank you, that's okay, I can move around a little bit. Okay, the psychology of smartphone engagement and how we can make sense of this as people who are presumably interested in collecting consumer insights through mobile technology. All right, so hopefully we are all quite familiar with this concept or this phenomenon of constant connectivity. So as we mentioned earlier in the great borderless access presentation, my guess is that most of you started your day by reaching for that little device that spent the night recharging by your side while you tried to do the same. There are all sorts of numbers out there that my guess is most of you are familiar with as well. Amusing statistics like in 2012, 19% of us dropped our mobile device in the toilet, or there are more mobile phone subscriptions in the world than there are toothbrushes. But beyond those numbers, even in markets that are completely saturated with mobile technology, we really see that it's changing our world. So mobile technology is changing the way that we learn, it's changing the way that we remember, and it's also changing the way that we interact with our loved ones, whether they live next door or half a world away. So psychologists are actually just beginning to understand, and this is something I've spent quite a bit of time on myself over the past few years, just beginning to understand how this kind of constant checking behavior impacts our sense of well-being and our general psychological state. And what I want to spend some time talking to you today is more how this makes sense. Why does this apply to market researchers? Why does it matter? And how can you hopefully benefit from this phenomenon of constant connectivity when creating your next research program? All right, so I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about some anecdotal and scientific evidence that speaks to people's experience from a psychological perspective when it comes to smartphone use. So there's quite a bit of evidence out there that speaks to the negative effects of smartphone use. There's some clinical research out of MIT that suggests that we're actually allowing our mobile devices to steal us away from the moment at hand, causing us to miss out on our real life. There's other research by Carr and Fox that suggests that our minds are never focused on the task at hand, meaning that we're never really fully present. My guess is you're all familiar with checking your smartphone late at night and potentially the detrimental effects that has on your quality of sleep. And there are also some studies out there that speak to the worrisome concerns of our engagement with social media and how that's affecting our general sense of well-being. But as with most findings in this space, there also are quite a few findings that speak to the positive effects of smartphone engagement. So we see that using our smartphone in a certain way can actually increase feelings of effectiveness and productivity. Some smartphone engagement actually lends itself to the phenomenon of transactive memory, which is basically knowing where to look for something rather than retaining that specific information. Rather, you remember where to look for it. And that can help free us up to have more meaningful memory and potentially free us from the mundane or trivial tasks in our daily life. And then there's also some research that suggests that virtual social connection can actually provide a buffer against stress and pain. So clearly there's some contradictory evidence going on here. And what I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking to you about are three key questions that look to dive into this a little bit more in terms of the high-level psychology and motivation behind it. So these were actually the three key questions that I was looking at in my dissertation research. And I'm not going to spend too much time getting into the theory, really much at all. I want to talk more about how this applies to this particular audience and how we can make sense of it from a market research perspective. But these are the three questions that I looked at. So what fuels this need to check our mobile device constantly? What motivates this behavior? And how does this behavior really impact our sense of well-being? Right, so over the course of a 2-week period, we collected data from 400 demographically representative Americans. This was a within subjects longitudinal design. So at the start of week 1 and at the end of week 2, we collected a bunch of questionnaires. Most of them were motivational questionnaires, scales around well-being, and also really looking to understand people's relationship with their smartphone and how they engage with their device, what it really means to them. And then during the course of that 2-week period, we also had a passive meter running in the back end, so we were able to collect all of this passive usage information to really understand the checking behavior beyond the self-report measures. So obviously, this resulted in some big data. And what I want to, I'll touch on some of the high-level results, but it was a unique data set in that it had these psychological assessments, but there was also all of this raw checking behavior, so we were really able to dive in there. So I'd say the key, though, is figuring out, again, how we can bring this back, how we can make sense of this when it comes to consumer insight capture. So very high level, what I want to focus on is this concept of the subjective experience. So this is a quick visualization of the data. And again, when I'm talking about the subjective experience, I mean the participant's experience or the user's experience with their smartphone. So how they're engaging with it, why it matters to them. And this graph here, it's just high level. If you take a look at the y-axis, this is well-being. The x-axis has subjectively valuable use. And the red line that's in the upward trajectory is predicted well-being, as defined by a commonly used scale known as flourishing. And then the little blue dots are observed flourishing or well-being. So what we see going on here is that when smartphone engagement is experienced as valuable, it's increasing well-being. And when smartphone engagement is experienced as valueless, it's actually resulting in lower scores of well-being. Now, it's worth mentioning here that it's definitely the subjective experience that is driving this result. We actually had a very representative sample in terms of the overall population, how people score on scales of well-being. So there was a nice even distribution there. So it's definitely the subjective experience that matters here. So how can we make sense of all this information? How can we make it matter when it comes to our respondents, to our panelists, the people that we're trying to understand and gauge their reaction to certain products or shopping experiences, whatever it might be? So what I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about is actually how people are using their device, where they're spending the most time, and again, why it might matter to them as consumers or just simply as users of the smartphone, as so many of us are, on an extremely regular basis. Hopefully, as I go into some of these next few slides, you can spend some time thinking about how you might be able to make sense of these results and how you can bring in some of the psychological findings to enhance your mobile research. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about actual usage data, and this is actually taken from some recent ComScore and Flurry data. It's similar to some of the raw data that I pulled for my dissertation research, but it's a little prettier up here. So what's worth mentioning is that people are clearly spending most of their smartphone FaceTime in a native app. 86% of their smartphone FaceTime, in fact. And when you look at what apps they're actually using, it's often a gaming sort of app, 32% in some sort of game, about 28% in Facebook or social media. So people are deriving some sort of value, or at least perceived value, which we know is very important, from their interactions with these kinds of apps on their device. So maybe they're looking to seek new information, reaching out to their social network for something, or simply just looking to be entertained. So in some way, they're deriving value or a meaningful subjective experience from this kind of smartphone engagement. So with all of that in mind, again, in the framework of market research, I want to talk about knowing that people spend so much time in their native apps. How can we take advantage of this and understand more about how people are, or knowing rather, how people are already engaging with their device? Now, it is worth mentioning at Lumi, we are very focused on our native app, but we also have a mobile web solution, and that's something that certainly has a time and place. But the findings that I have from my research very much support the benefits of the native app approach in terms of engaging with people in a more meaningful way. So these are the 5 key points that I see when it comes to a native app approach. Really keeping it in context and making it relevant to your end user. So throughout the next few slides, I'm going to keep coming back to why this matters to the end user and how you can incorporate this into your research. So the first point is geofencing. We've had a few presentations already walk through the benefits of geofencing technology, and this really does promote data collection within the context of location. So often, our smartphones are never more than an arm's length away, and people really are willing to engage if it's relevant to them. So using geofencing capabilities really allows for this kind of input of relevant, or making it that much more relevant to the user, and ultimately providing a higher quality of data, because people are much more inclined to provide higher quality data if they can find some sort of value in it. I'm sure you all know, if you receive a survey in your email after you took a trip somewhere and it was from your airline experience, you would be so much more likely to provide meaningful feedback in the moment when you were actually at the airport, or perhaps shortly after you left the airport, but not so much 2 or 3 days after the fact when you don't really care and you've already moved on to the next thing. The last point about location is that it really does ensure that the respondent is having a genuine experience. We've all seen data that we know that we have to do quite a bit of data cleaning on, because you just have to take out the people that you know aren't actually having that legitimate experience. Now we can have much more confidence in knowing where that person was, at what point in time they were providing that kind of feedback. So the next key benefit that we see is the use of in-app notifications. There's just some recent data released by Localytics that talked about how much more engaged people are with their native apps when they enable in-app notifications. They actually see people are 88% more likely to stay engaged if in-app notifications are enabled than if they're not. And there are also some impressive stats around retention of using the app rather than just deleting it or never engaging with it again, sort of a one-time use case. We're also quite familiar with in-app notifications. People see them as sort of a happy medium, this unobtrusive nudge or friendly reminder, rather than, say, sending a text message that might be perceived as a bit more invasive, or sending an email where we're already so inundated with email. This in-app reminder seems to be kind of a happy medium, and you can take advantage of the location component, but also time-based reminders as well as behavior-based reminders. A study that we're currently conducting in the US really speaks to the improved response rates. So we are doing a longitudinal tracking study. It's a consumption diary over a 2-week period. And once people have downloaded the app, largely because of in-app notifications, we're seeing anywhere between 70 and 80% response rates, which is really quite impressive for a long-term tracking study. There's also a very clear reduction in memory bias for all of the obvious reasons that have been mentioned today, and again, the familiarity component. So this is definitely a key benefit across the board. Then there's offline capability. So at times this might, depending upon where you're from, this might not seem super relevant, but it really is all about accessibility and convenience for the end user. So if somebody's easily able to access your survey, take your poll, whatever it might be, they're that much more willing to engage because it's, again, the subjectively positive experience. The offline capability really comes into play perhaps in a healthcare setting, if you're in a hospital's kind of situation. Maybe you're just taking the underground home, or you're on an airplane, allowing people to take advantage of that downtime. And because the latest Mary Meeker statistics around number of times people are engaging with their smartphone, she says it's about 150. I know earlier today somebody said 110. Somewhere in there, it's a lot of checking that takes place. The offline capability definitely allows you to take advantage of that constant checking behavior. And then there's rich media capture. So we all like taking pictures. We know a picture's worth 1,000 words. And it really allows, again, this context and puts the data that's being captured more in the moment. It captures the significance, and you're able to see things through the lens of the consumer or your panelist or whomever you're trying to understand information from. And people just like taking pictures, so I'm sure some of you have taken at least a few selfies so far today. It's just a way to engage people in a way that they find fun or entertaining. And then finally, the last kind of benefit encompasses all of them to a certain extent. So you really see the native app as this sticky touch point that allows people to come back whenever it's convenient for them, wherever they might be, if they want to take a picture, if they want to take advantage of their location. Once that app download has occurred, it's this regular touch point that people can interact with. And from a panel perspective, it's so much easier to just send out a pulse, sort of gauge your audience, knowing where people are based or some particular activity that they're engaged in. It's not necessary to start from scratch with each new recruitment because you have this sort of mobile-ready, willing and able to engage audience, and that can really bring your research to life. So I just want to wrap all of that up. Hopefully it's been clear, sort of moving from the psychology of our motivation to stay engaged with our mobile devices, how constantly we are connected to these, smartphones. Making it a relevant experience is really essential. Knowing how people are using their phones, knowing what kind of apps they like to engage in, all of that matters. So if you're able to create a relevant experience, you can not only potentially increase well-being, but something that we should all really care about is the higher engagement and presumably better data quality that we're able to capture if we use this approach. And I think this is particularly relevant not only for the future of market research, but we all want to stay relevant in the future and make sure that our voices are heard, but I think it really matters for today because we're already there with mobile from the consumer perspective, and we're definitely playing some catch up when it comes to market research. So I think there's just a real opportunity to capitalize on this phenomenon of constant connectivity from a psychological perspective, but most importantly, in this case, from a consumer insight perspective. So I will leave you guys with that. Thanks. I think I have time for questions.
Good. All right. Questions? Yep. Yes, sir. Dan, is it? Yes? Thank you.
I thought it was really interesting, so thank you.
Thanks.
I have kind of two questions. One of them is your data was collected with an American audience. So of course, the question is, how relevant are those findings more broadly on a global basis? And then the second part is around how you measured well-being. Did you consider using other sources such as mappiness?
All right, good questions. Thanks, Dan. So the first, I do think, and this was purely American audience, I would love to be able to extend to a wider geography. Certainly the passive data collection piece is a bit more complicated rather than just being able to take a global pulse. But I do think because, all of people in this room are coming from all different areas from around the world, and I think we can all relate to this phenomenon of constant connectivity. People are very much engaged with their smartphone or their feature phone, regardless of location. Obviously, there are capabilities that you can have with a smartphone that you don't have with a feature phone. But I do believe that people still are very much connected, regardless of location. So I believe that these findings can be extended to a larger global audience. The question in terms of the well-being, so again, the Mappiness is an interesting app. I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with it, but I've never used it myself, but the way that I understand it is that you sort of receive a random notification at any point during the time, and it's just asking you, what's your mood, how are you feeling? So it's interesting. You can sort of track your mood over time and see how things change. That sort of would have been a nice addition, I'd say, to the research. I'd say it was fortunate to be able to have this within subjects longitudinal design, so we were actually able to get people coming back to take the different psychological measures and sort of general relationship with your smartphone kind of questions. And I actually had 3 or 4 different well-being measures that were used and have been validated in a lot of different psychological research. So anyway, it would be a nice extension, but Yes, it was pretty thorough in terms of the different types of well-being scales that were measured.
Oh, another question? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Naomi Amakal from McKinsey & Company. I had a question regarding the intrusiveness issue of the in-app. Was particularly wondering, was there a significant difference in any demographics in terms of, how receptive people were, whether it's generations, regions, metro versus suburban, any distinctions?
To receiving the in-app notifications, you mean? So I didn't pulse that specific question. I didn't ask people specifically how they felt about receiving notifications. For the most part, in terms of the passive meter, the majority of participants did enable notifications. I think that is, again, this is somewhat anecdotal, but I believe that's somewhat of a demographic, contingent upon demographics, but I think anybody that's engaged with their smartphone or their feature phone with mobile technology in general, I believe benefits regularly from those notifications. I think the key for market researchers, you can check in the settings of your smartphone what apps you have, what notifications are enabled for what app. So there are a lot of apps that I use that I have the notifications turned off, but there are a lot that it's the apps that I value, the apps that I want to get news alerts or updates or some sort of social update. It's the ones that I care about. So I think our real challenge as market researchers is figuring out how to get your app to the level where people care enough about it. They're engaged at a level where they're willing to turn those notifications on because it's relevant to them and because they're having an experience that they feel is meaningful.
I've got one question. Is
Sure.
how far in your research was the relationship between smartphone use and well-being? How much was that correlation? How much was that causality?
Good question. It was largely, I think, correlational data. There was an interesting discrepancy. So I had the raw checking behavior, and then I also had more of the subjective experience. The two were very much related. The more the stronger effect statistically, it was actually more on the subjective experience side of things. So it was the self-report was stronger, which one could say that there was an interesting parallel between, with the borderless access presentation earlier, what people are actually self-reporting. But I think it all comes back to perception and how people are perceiving that they're engaging with their device and the relationship that they have with their phone. It does have an effect on them, whether or not they would think that it does. So.
Yeah, thank you. Any more? Yes, sir. How does it feel out in the Ulu?
I'm saying that our teens more in
teens.
Are they not concerned with respect to social well-being or not well-being, or this phenomena is more with people above the age of 25 years?
Yeah. So if I'm hearing your question correctly, I believe it says there a difference in age, right. Teens compared to adults. There actually was not a statistically significant difference in age, which I was expecting. I actually thought that people who were presumably in the younger demographic would be either more engaged in terms of their checking behavior. It was actually not a huge difference. And in terms of the actual breakdown of my participants, it was pretty evenly distributed across socioeconomic status, all sorts of different background, age. So surprisingly, actually, there was not a difference in the data that I collected when it came to age. Good. All right, well, thank you all.
Thank you very much, yes. Okay, perfect.